Your Honor, she can barely pay rent. My father dragged me to court over our family's $31 million empire. The judge smirked, looking down at me like a nuisance. And she expects to control an estate, he asked as the gallery chuckled. Then I stood up and said, I am J. L. Sterling, the primary creditor holding the notes to this entire estate. The judge's smile vanished instantly. I am Jasmine, 35 years old. Before I continue this story about how my own family tried to ruin me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The air conditioning in the downtown Atlanta courtroom struggled against the heavy July heat pressing against the windows. But the real chill came from the man standing at the plaintiff table. My father Jeremiah wore his custom-tailored navy suit like a suit of armor. He was the patriarch of a prestigious black-owned real estate empire, a man who commanded respect in boardrooms and Sunday church services alike. He approached the bench with the smooth, confident stride of a man entirely used to getting his way. Without a single word of preamble, he tossed a thick stack of papers directly in front of Judge Montgomery. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. These are her recent bank statements, Your Honor, along with 3 separate eviction notices. My father declared, his baritone voice projecting perfectly so the entire gallery could hear. He pointed a manicured finger in my direction without actually making eye contact with me. My daughter is a financial liability. She is a prodigal child who has squandered every opportunity given to her, and now she sits here trying to extort the legacy her mother and I built from the ground up. I sat at the defense table, keeping my face completely neutral. My hands were folded neatly in my lap. I did not flinch, even though his words were designed to strip away my dignity piece by piece. The bank statements he submitted were real, but they were from an old decoy account I had deliberately let run dry months ago. The eviction notices were from an apartment I had moved out of specifically to let him think I was struggling. He had taken the bait perfectly. As he continued to paint a picture of me as a desperate, failing woman, I allowed myself to glance at the front row of the gallery. There sat my younger sister, Chantal. She was the undisputed golden child of the family, a prominent cosmetic surgeon who treated Atlanta high society. She wore a pristine white designer dress that screamed quiet wealth, her hair perfectly styled to project the flawless image our father demanded. She was whispering behind her hand, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter, as our father assassinated my character on the public record. Beside her sat her husband, Trent. Trent was a high-level investment banker, a white man who had eagerly married into our affluent black family and immediately started acting like he owned our history. He leaned back on the wooden bench, crossing one leg over his knee with absolute arrogance. He did not bother to whisper when he leaned his head toward Chantal. It is sad, really, Trent said, his voice carrying easily across the short distance separating us. She should have learned the value of a hard-earned dollar instead of relying on handouts and affirmative action her whole life. The corporate world does not coddle people who cannot pull their own weight. The sheer audacity of his statement made my blood run cold. Here was a man who had been handed a senior executive role at his father's bank right out of college, sitting in a courtroom lecturing a black woman about handouts while actively participating in a legal scheme to steal the $31 million empire my late mother had sacrificed her health to build. My mother was the true architect of our family wealth. She was the one who bought the dilapidated commercial lots in neglected neighborhoods, the one who saw the potential for community revitalization long before gentrification made those areas profitable. My father had simply been the charismatic face of the operation. But when she passed away 3 years ago, he did not mourn the loss of his partner. He celebrated the removal of his only equal. He immediately began treating the company like his personal piggy bank, funding Chantal's lavish lifestyle and setting the stage to hand the reins over to Trent. Trent had always viewed me with barely concealed contempt. From the moment Chantal brought him home, he had treated our family's wealth as his rightful inheritance. He loved the proximity to black wealth, but resented the black women who created it. He constantly undermined my business acumen at family dinners, suggesting my startup ventures were cute little hobbies. He believed that because my companies operated in the digital space outside traditional brick and mortar real estate, I was simply playing on a computer while he handled real money. His arrogant comment about affirmative action was just the latest in a long line of racial and gendered slights he felt comfortable delivering under the protective umbrella of my father's approval. My father had enabled all of it. Jeremiah Sterling cared only about the optics. He wanted a perfect family photo for the charity galas. A beautiful doctor-daughter, a wealthy banking son-in-law, and a compliant middle child who stayed quiet and looked grateful. When I refused to play the quiet, grateful role, when I started asking hard questions about where the company capital was flowing and why properties my mother explicitly wanted kept for community housing were being sold off to corporate developers, I became the enemy. I became the problem that needed to be surgically removed from the family tree. Judge Montgomery, an older white man who clearly belonged to the same exclusive country clubs as my father, and Trent adjusted his glasses and looked over the misleading documents. He nodded sympathetically at my father's tragic tale of a disappointed parent burdened by a failing child. The judge possessed that particular kind of old boys club mentality, easily charmed by a wealthy patriarch and inherently suspicious of an independent single woman sitting without expensive legal representation. Mr. Sterling, I understand your position, the judge said, his tone dripping with condescension as he finally looked down at me. It is a tragedy when a child strays so far from the path of success a family has paved for them. Given these financial records, it is clear that allowing her to manage or retain any portion of a $31 million commercial estate would be an act of gross negligence. I watched as my father puffed out his chest victorious. Chantal smirked openly, now leaning her head against Trent's shoulder. Trent shot me a look of pure pity, the kind of look you give a stray dog you have just kicked off your pristine porch. They genuinely believed they had won. They believed they had successfully painted me as a destitute failure, an ugly mark on their pristine legacy of black excellence. They thought they were about to walk out of this courtroom with total control over my mother's life work, leaving me with absolutely nothing. What none of them realized was that every single action they had taken today, every insult they had hurled, every piece of fake evidence they had eagerly presented was exactly what I had planned for. I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, letting their arrogance reach its absolute peak before I prepared to tear their entire world apart. But to understand how we reached this bitter courtroom showdown, you have to understand the night the illusion of our family finally shattered completely. Judge Montgomery leans over his heavy oak podium, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He tells me I am dangerously close to being held in contempt of court for obstructing the seamless transfer of these corporate shares. He makes it clear that the 20% voting power my mother specifically left in my name is nothing more than a clerical error in his eyes, a nuisance currently blocking a man who prefers my brother-in-law Trent, holding the reins of a black-owned legacy. The judge warns me that he will not tolerate frivolous delays from a disgruntled daughter who refuses to accept her place. My father stands up, buttoning his custom suit jacket with a practiced air of weary patience. He plays the benevolent, exhausted patriarch perfectly for the gallery. He tells the judge he wants to be fair despite my supposed insubordination. He claims he wants to give me one final chance to walk away with some shred of dignity. He gestures to his high-priced corporate lawyer, a man who charges more per hour than I supposedly make in a month. The lawyer slides a thick, stapled legal document across the plaintiff table, then walks it over and places it right in front of me. My father speaks down to me, his deep voice echoing off the marble walls of the courtroom. He tells me it is a comprehensive waiver. If I sign over my voting rights to the $31 million estate today, right now, he will graciously write me a check for a $5,000 relocation fee. He actually calls it a relocation fee with a straight face. He tells me to take the money, pack up my modest apartment, move to a cheaper city, and try to start over where the cost of living matches my limited capabilities. If I refuse his generous offer, He promises to bury me in so many legal filings that I will owe his firm money for the rest of my natural life. Chantal lets out a soft, mocking sigh from the gallery, crossing her arms as if bored by my stubbornness. Trent mutters to her loud enough for the court reporter to hear that $5,000 is overly generous for someone who adds absolutely zero value to the company ledger. I look down at the waiver sitting on the defense table. It is a single signature designed to erase my mother's decades of sacrifice and hand the keys of our empire to a white investment banker who routinely jokes about affirmative action at our Sunday dinners. They expect me to break. They expect the weight of the legal system, my father's crushing disapproval, and my sister's relentless mockery to finally bring me to my knees. I do not pick up the pen. I do not let a single tear touch my face. The days of me crying over my father's calculated cruelty are long gone. Instead, I reach into my structured leather tote bag. I slowly pull out a single unmarked black folder. The heavy cardstock makes a soft sliding sound as I push it across the smooth surface of the defense table. I look directly at the bailiff and politely ask him to present the document to Judge Montgomery. My father scoffs, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. He tells the judge not to waste his valuable time, claiming I probably printed out more useless business plans for my little internet startups. He tells the court I am prone to delusions of grandeur. Trent laughs openly now, leaning forward in the gallery pew to watch my supposed final meltdown. I ignore them completely and keep my eyes locked on my father. I ask his legal team to confirm a simple financial reality for the court record. 6 months ago, his commercial real estate firm was bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. The flagship properties my mother purchased decades ago were facing immediate foreclosure because Trent made a highly leveraged, catastrophic gamble in the commercial development market. To cover up Trent's massive failure and save face in the Atlanta business community, my father quietly sought a massive high-risk bridge loan. My father's confident posture instantly stiffens. The color drains slightly from his knuckles as he grips the edge of his mahogany table. I continue speaking, my voice clear, cold, and carrying perfectly across the silent room. I ask my father if he remembers the exact terms of that desperate loan. He secured $31 million through an anonymous private equity firm based out of Delaware. He put up the entirety of the family empire as collateral, assuming his new golden boy Trent would generate enough returns to quietly pay it back before the aggressive maturity date. Trent abruptly stops laughing. He sits up straight, running a hand through his hair and glancing nervously at my father. Chantal looks confused, sensing the sudden violent shift in the room's energy, but not entirely grasping the financial gravity of my words. I turn my attention back to the bench. Judge Montgomery, initially visibly annoyed by my interruption, carelessly flips open the black folder. I tell the court that the document inside is the original unredacted promissory note for that bridge loan, complete with the acceleration clause triggered by a default that occurred exactly 48 hours ago. The judge adjusts his glasses. His eyes scan the first page. The smug, condescending smile that had been plastered on his face for the last hour instantly evaporates. His mouth falls slightly open. He flips to the second page, his hands now visibly trembling against the wood of his podium. The old boys' club bravado completely shatters as he reads the name of the primary creditor, the sole owner of the private equity firm holding the debt to my father's entire $31 million empire. Judge Montgomery slowly lifts his head. He stares at me, absolute terror replacing the arrogant dismissal in his eyes. 3 weeks before that absolute silence fell over the courtroom, my father thought he was the most powerful man in Atlanta. It was the night of the 40th business anniversary gala for Sterling Real Estate Holdings. The event was held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, a lavish affair designed entirely to stroke my father's massive ego. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of Atlanta's black elite. Mayors, city council members, real estate developers, and high society socialites mingled over silver platters of hors d'oeuvres and imported champagne. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, setting the perfect soundtrack for a night dedicated to celebrating wealth and influence. It was supposed to be a celebration of the empire my mother literally worked herself into an early grave to build. She was the one who had the vision 40 years ago. But looking around the opulent room, her name was nowhere to be found. Instead, massive banners bearing my father's face hung from the walls, proclaiming his singular genius and his dedication to Black excellence. It was a masterclass in rewriting history, and I was expected to play my part as the dutiful silent daughter. I arrived wearing a custom emerald silk gown, holding a leather-bound portfolio containing a collection of my mother's original architectural sketches I had restored as a gift for the anniversary. As I stepped through the gilded double doors of the ballroom, I looked toward the front of the room. The Sterling family table was positioned squarely in the center, draped in white linen and overflowing with white orchids. I saw Chantal already seated there laughing loudly and adjusting her diamond necklace for a passing photographer. Trent was beside her shaking hands with a group of potential investors, acting as if he had laid the very bricks of the buildings they were celebrating. I took a step toward my rightful seat at that table, but before I could cross the threshold, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I turned to see my father, Jeremiah. His jaw was clenched tight, but he maintained a frozen artificial smile for the benefit of the passing guests. His grip on my shoulder was punishing a physical warning to fall in line. He forcefully steered me away from the ballroom entrance and into a dimly lit coat-check corridor, out of sight of the cameras and the wealthy attendees. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. Without a single word, he reached into his tuxedo pocket, pulled out a cheap plastic lanyard with a laminated vendor badge attached to it, and shoved it directly against my chest. I looked down at the plastic badge, then back up at him in pure confusion. I asked him what this was supposed to mean. I reminded him that I was his daughter, and that my seat was at the head table with the rest of the family. My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the narrow corridor. He stepped closer, towering over me, his voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper. He told me I had absolutely no business sitting at the head table tonight. He explicitly stated that this gala was the most important networking event of his career, a night designed to secure millions in new investments. He needed to project an image of absolute perfection, of flawless Black excellence. And according to him, I did not fit that image. He looked me up and down with utter disgust. He called my life a mess. He told me my unpredictable startup lifestyle, working out of coffee shops and chasing digital ghosts, was an embarrassment to the Sterling name. He pointed a finger at my chest and reminded me that I was always a disappointment. He compared me directly to Chantal, praising her medical degree and her pristine country club lifestyle. He practically glowed when he mentioned Trent boasting about his son-in-law's elite banking pedigree, and how Trent represented the kind of serious traditional wealth the investors wanted to see. "You are a liability, Jasmine," he snarled, his words dripping with contempt. "I am not going to let you sit at the front of that room and answer questions from billionaires about your little computer hobbies. You bring no value to this family, and you certainly bring no value to this company. You are going to take this badge, and you are going to sit exactly where I tell you to sit. If you cannot handle that, you can turn around and walk right back out the door." He pointed his finger past the grand ballroom, gesturing toward the dark, chaotic corner at the very back of the venue. He told me he had set up a place for me at a tiny overflow table right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. He ordered me to stay there, to keep my mouth shut, and to stay entirely out of the professional photographer's sightlines. He warned me not to approach the investors and not to speak to the press. I was to be invisible. The sheer cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was taking the empire my mother built, erasing her memory, elevating a white man who openly disrespected us, and banishing his own Black daughter to the shadows, because my self-made success did not fit his archaic, narrow definition of what wealth should look like. My mother had taught me everything I knew about business, about staying sharp and moving silently, but seeing my father so eagerly discard me to protect his fragile ego was a unique kind of agony. I stood in that coat-check corridor holding the heavy leather portfolio of my mother's sketches. I could have screamed. I could have thrown the gift at his feet and stormed out of the hotel, giving him exactly the dramatic reaction he expected from his supposedly erratic daughter. I could have caused a massive scene right there in the lobby and ruined his perfect night. But I did not. I took a slow, deep breath, reining in the sudden spike of adrenaline. I looked my father dead in the eyes, my expression completely blank. I took the cheap plastic vendor badge from his hand and slipped the scratchy lanyard over my head, letting the plastic rest against my expensive emerald silk. I did not utter a single word of protest. I simply turned on my heel and walked away from him. I walked past the glittering chandeliers and the towering floral arrangements. I walked the long, humiliating gauntlet past the VIP tables, ignoring the confused stares of old family friends who recognized me. I walked past Chantal, who was too busy posing for a selfie to even notice her sister, and past Trent, who was loudly bragging about a golf handicap to a group of bored executives. I walked all the way to the back of the room, exactly where my father had pointed. The table was small and wobbly, covered in a cheap white cloth. It was positioned directly in the path of the busy waitstaff. The harsh fluorescent light from the kitchen glared through the swinging doors every time a waiter rushed past with a tray of dirty dishes. The smell of dishwater and industrial cleaner completely overpowered the scent of the expensive catered food. I sat down alone in the shadows. I placed my mother's sketches gently on the wobbly table. I bit my tongue and remained perfectly still. From my banished corner, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I watched my father take the stage to thunderous applause. I watched Chantal and Trent toast their glasses of champagne, preening for the crowd, radiating a toxic, unearned arrogance. They paraded around the room, shaking hands and accepting praise, so deeply intoxicated by their own perceived power and brilliance. I sat at the back and watched them celebrate, completely at peace with the plastic badge around my neck. They were so busy desperately protecting the facade of their empire that they were completely blind to the reality of their situation. I watched them smile for the cameras, entirely unaware of the catastrophic financial storm currently brewing over their heads. I sat in the dim lighting of my exiled corner, listening to the rhythmic squeak of the kitchen doors and the clatter of busboys dropping off dirty plates. Out on the main floor, the jazz band transitioned into a lively, upbeat tune. The room was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Through the crowd, I spotted Trent breaking away from a group of wealthy investors. He had a cocktail in one hand, the ice clinking softly against the expensive crystal glass. He caught my eye, and a slow, patronizing smirk spread across his face. He navigated through the tables, moving with that effortless, unearned swagger of a man who had been handed the keys to a kingdom he did not build. He stopped at my tiny, wobbly table and looked down at me. He did not bother to hide his amusement at my plastic vendor badge. He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch to maximize his own perceived dominance. "You know, Jasmine," he began, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, "I actually told your father he was being too hard on you by putting you back here with the help. But looking at you now, maybe he had a point. You really do not blend in with this crowd." I kept my hands folded neatly over my leather portfolio. I did not offer him a seat. I did not offer him a reaction. Trent leaned closer, resting his free hand on my table. It wobbled under his weight, making a pathetic scraping sound against the floor. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Listen, I know your little app businesses are probably struggling right now. The tech world is a shark tank, and some people just are not built for generational wealth. It takes a certain pedigree to handle real money. But I am a generous guy. My bank is expanding our front office staff next month. We need a new receptionist. The pay is modest, but it comes with health insurance. I could put in a good word for you. It would be a step up from begging your father for scraps." He stood up straight, immensely proud of his own condescension. He honestly believed he was putting me in my place, cementing his position as the new heir to the Sterling Empire, while offering me a pity job answering his phone calls. He was implying my father was absolutely right to cut me out of the legacy, that I was nothing more than a failed experiment of a daughter. I looked at him, studying the smug satisfaction radiating from his pores. I smiled politely, a cold, hollow smile that did not reach my eyes. Thank you for the generous offer, Trent, I replied smoothly. I will be sure to keep your bank in mind when I am evaluating my operational assets. He chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a child playing dress-up. You do that, Jasmine. Just try not to cause a scene tonight. We have actual billionaires in the room. Before Trent could turn and strut back to the head table, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open with a violent crash. The loud bang echoed over the soft jazz music, causing several guests at the nearby tables to jump in their seats. Out marched the head caterer, a highly respected and notoriously fiery man who ran the most exclusive culinary service in Atlanta. He was not wearing his usual polite, invisible catering smile. His face was flushed red with absolute fury, and he was marching directly toward the center of the ballroom. He completely ignored the unwritten rules of high society galas. He did not pull a manager aside. He did not whisper. He marched straight up to the head table, bypassing security and stopping dead in front of my father. The jazz band faltered a few wrong notes, bleeding into the air as the musicians noticed the confrontation. Jeremiah, the head caterer, barked, his voice booming across the suddenly quiet room. People at the surrounding tables stopped eating. Heads turned. I need to speak with you immediately. My father quickly stood up, his face flashing with irritation at the breach of protocol. He tried to place a heavy, calming hand on the caterer's shoulder, attempting to steer him toward the exit. Please keep your voice down, my father hissed through clenched teeth. We are in the middle of a celebration. We can handle whatever minor logistical issue you have later. There is no later, the caterer shot back, slapping my father's hand away. He held up a thick digital tablet. Your accounts payable department assured me the final wire transfer for tonight's event would clear by 5 o'clock today. I just checked with my bank. The wire bounced. You owe me $45,000 for the Wagyu beef and imported seafood alone, not to mention the staff wages. If I do not see an approved transaction on this terminal right now, I am going into that kitchen. I am telling my staff to pack up the main course, and I am leaving your guests with empty plates. A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. The mayor of Atlanta, sitting just 2 seats away, looked down at his empty salad plate with raised eyebrows. Whispers began to spread through the ballroom like wildfire. The words bounced wire, and $45,000 echoed from table to table. My father's perfect image, his carefully curated illusion of massive wealth and unshakable stability, was actively bleeding out onto the ballroom floor. Jeremiah Sterling was paralyzed. I could see the panic flashing in his eyes. He knew exactly why that wire had bounced. He knew the company accounts were frozen, completely locked down, because their operating software license had expired, a license owned by my holding company. But he could not admit that here. He could not admit to these billionaire investors that he was entirely locked out of his own money. That was when Trent saw his opportunity to play the hero. He practically jogged away from my table, abandoning his cocktail on a passing tray. He pushed through the crowd, adjusting his suit jacket, ready to save his father-in-law and prove his immense value to the Sterling legacy. Hold on, calm down, Trent said loudly, projecting his voice so the investors could hear him take charge. There is obviously just a clerical error with the corporate bank, a simple fraud hold on a large transfer. I am a senior executive at Vanguard Financial. I will handle this right now. Trent pulled his wallet from his breast pocket with a dramatic flourish. He extracted a heavy elite corporate credit card, solid metal, and supposedly with an unlimited balance. He held it out to the caterer with a condescending smile. Run this for the 45,000, he commanded, and add a 20% gratuity for your trouble. Let us get back to the celebration. My father let out a massive, visible sigh of relief. He patted Trent on the back, looking around at the guests to show them everything was under control. The investors nodded approvingly. Trent looked over his shoulder, seeking me out in the shadows, making sure I was watching him save the day with the real money he had just lectured me about. The caterer snatched the metal card and swiped it firmly through his mobile terminal. The machine processed for an agonizing 5 seconds. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then a loud, piercing electronic buzz echoed from the device. The screen flashed bright red. Declined, the caterer announced, his voice carrying easily to the surrounding tables. Trent's smug smile instantly vanished. He blinked, staring at the little red screen. "That is impossible," he stammered, patting his pockets. "Run it again. The chip must be dirty." The caterer ran it again. Another loud, humiliating buzz. Declined. Trent's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He frantically pulled out his wallet again. Wait. Just use my personal black card. The corporate card must have a weekend limit." He shoved another elite card into the caterer's hand. The machine processed. Buzz. Declined. The whispers in the room morphed into open, shocked murmurs. High society guests were literally covering their mouths. Trent was frantically pulling out every card in his wallet, shoving them at the machine one by one. Every single one triggered the same loud, aggressive buzz of rejection. His personal checking, his joint account with Chantal, his emergency credit lines. Everything was returning a hard, undeniable denial. He did not know that earlier that afternoon my venture capital firm had quietly initiated the final stages of a hostile takeover of his parent bank. He did not know that his accounts had been frozen pending an executive audit. The caterer shoved the useless plastic back into Trent's chest. "This is a joke," he yelled, completely out of patience. "You people are frauds. I am pulling the food right now. And when I walk out those doors, I am calling the Atlanta Business Chronicle. I am calling the local news. I am going to let everyone in this city know that Sterling Real Estate Holdings cannot even afford to feed their own guests." My father, a man who built his entire life on the perception of absolute power, stood frozen in the center of his own anniversary gala. He was sweating profusely, the moisture beading on his forehead and soaking into the collar of his custom tuxedo. His eyes darted wildly around the room, watching his empire of lies begin to collapse as the caterer turned to walk away. The silence in the grand ballroom was suffocating. My father stood frozen under the glittering chandeliers, a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of limitless power, currently being publicly humiliated over a catering bill. Trent was frantically swiping at the terminal screen, his face a mottled, panicked red, desperately muttering about bank errors and weekend limits. The head caterer was not listening. He was already signaling his staff to begin clearing the untouched plates from the VIP tables. The whispers from the mayor's table grew louder, sharp, and inquisitive. The facade was cracking, and my father had absolutely no idea how to stop it. I pushed my chair back from the wobbly table in the shadows. The sound of wood scraping against the marble floor was barely audible, but it felt monumental to me. I stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald silk gown. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who knew exactly how much power she held in the room. As I stepped out of the dim lighting near the kitchen doors and into the center of the ballroom, the whispers began to shift. Eyes tracked my movement. I walked past the murmuring politicians and the gaping socialites straight toward the chaotic scene unfolding at the head table. Trent saw me approaching, and his panicked expression morphed into a defensive sneer. He opened his mouth, likely to issue another patronizing insult or order me back to my corner. But I did not give him the chance. I did not look at him. I did not look at my father, whose chest was heaving with visible anxiety. I focused entirely on the head caterer. I reached into my structured leather clutch and pulled out a single heavy piece of solid black metal. It was an invite only. Centurion card, a financial instrument that required a minimum spending threshold most of the people in this room would never reach in a lifetime. I held it out. The caterer paused, his angry tirade dying in his throat as he registered the weight and significance of the card in my hand. He looked from the metal card up to my perfectly calm face. "Run it," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the absolute authority of someone who did not need to shout to be heard. The caterer took the card, his demeanor instantly shifting from hostile to profoundly deferential. He tapped the heavy metal against his mobile terminal. There was no agonizing wait. There was no spinning loading wheel. Instantly, a cheerful bright chime echoed from the device. The screen flashed a brilliant green. Approved. $45,000 paid in full without a single second of hesitation. The caterer let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. He handed the card back to me with a deep, respectful nod, apologizing for the disruption, and assuring me the main course would be served immediately. He signaled his staff, and the crisis vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Trent stared at the terminal in absolute shock. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes darting from the machine to the black card sliding effortlessly back into my clutch. My father stared at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. He looked at the daughter he had just banished to the kitchen doors, the daughter he had called a messy, unpredictable failure, and realized she held more liquid capital in her evening bag than his golden boy son-in-law held in his entire banking portfolio. I did not gloat. I did not offer a smug smile or wait for a pathetic, stammered thank you. I simply turned on my heel and walked away. I felt the eyes of every major investor in Atlanta burning into my back as I walked the long aisle, right back to my wobbly table in the shadows. I sat down, folded my hands over my mother's portfolio, and waited. The jazz band quickly resumed playing, trying to inject some life back into the stunned room. Waiters rushed out with silver platters, and the clinking of silverware slowly returned. But the energy had irrevocably shifted. The illusion of my father's untouchable empire had been breached. Yet I knew my father better than anyone. A man like Jeremiah Sterling would rather burn his own house to the ground than admit he needed a bucket of water from the daughter he despised. His ego had sustained a massive public injury, and he needed to reassert his dominance immediately. Barely 10 minutes later, before the main course was even finished, my father stormed the stage. He grabbed the microphone off the stand, the sudden feedback whining sharply through the speakers. He adjusted his suit jacket, pasting that familiar charismatic smile back onto his sweating face. He completely ignored the financial bailout that had just occurred. He did not acknowledge me, nor did he acknowledge the near disaster. Instead, he decided to spin a narrative of transition growth and aggressive corporate expansion. He spoke about the 40-year history of Sterling Real Estate Holdings. He spoke about my mother invoking her name to draw sympathetic applause from the crowd, expertly using the memory of the Black woman who built the foundation of our wealth to justify his next move. He told the audience that to honor her legacy, the company needed to evolve. He claimed that the modern financial landscape required ruthless traditional banking expertise. He spun a beautiful, tragic lie about stepping back and securing the future of the empire. Therefore, my father announced, his voice booming through the sound system, to ensure this company thrives for another 40 years, I am making a strategic executive appointment tonight. I am officially naming Trent as the new Chief Financial Officer of Sterling Real Estate Holdings. The room erupted in polite, manufactured applause. Chantal shrieked with joy, leaping up from her seat to hug her husband. Trent puffed out his chest, his earlier humiliation entirely forgotten, as he swaggered up onto the stage. He shook my father's hand, gripping my father's shoulder in a display of aggressive camaraderie. My father handed him the microphone, physically passing the power of our family over to him. I sat in the dark and felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. My mother had fought tooth and nail for every square foot of property in our portfolio. She had battled racist city councils, aggressive developers, and a banking system designed to lock Black women out. She had built this empire to keep wealth in our community, to build a legacy of Black ownership. And now my father was handing complete financial control of her life's work to a white outsider. He was handing the keys to the kingdom to a man who actively mocked our history, a man who believed my mother's success was just a lucky break he was entitled to manage. My father was erasing us just to protect his own fragile pride. Trent took the microphone. He looked out over the sea of wealthy faces soaking in the applause. Then his eyes scanned the back of the room. He found me sitting in the shadows by the kitchen doors. A slow, victorious smirk spread across his face. He actually raised his champagne glass in my direction, offering a silent, mocking toast to my absolute defeat. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully stolen my birthright. I looked at him standing on that stage wearing a crown he did not earn. I did not feel sad. I did not feel broken. I felt a supreme, terrifying clarity. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I bypassed my standard apps and opened a highly encrypted secure communication channel linked directly to my lead wealth manager at Sterling Capital. I did not hesitate. I typed a single 3-word message, the digital command that would trigger a financial avalanche they could not possibly survive. Initiate the takeover. I pressed send, dropped the phone back into my bag, and took a calm, refreshing sip of my water. The morning sunlight hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Real Estate Holdings executive boardroom, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. The room smelled of expensive coffee leather chairs and the distinct stale odor of old men clinging to power. My father sat at the head of the immense table, projecting the image of a benevolent king. Trent was seated immediately to his right, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that he probably bought on credit, looking impossibly smug. Chantal sat beside her husband, playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife to the hilt. The rest of the table was filled with the board of directors, a collection of my father's golfing buddies, and yes men who had rubber-stamped his decisions for the past decade. They were just settling in, adjusting their ties, and opening their leather portfolios. The agenda for the morning was singular and straightforward. They were here to formally ratify my father's sudden announcement from the gala. They were here to officially hand the financial reins of my mother's legacy over to a man who could not even cover a catering bill 12 hours prior. I did not bother knocking. I pushed open the heavy glass double doors and strode into the boardroom. I was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The low murmur of conversation instantly died. Every head in the room turned toward me. The collective shock on their faces was almost entertaining. I was the banished daughter, the outcast who was supposed to be nursing her wounds in the shadows. I was certainly not supposed to be interrupting the inner sanctum of their corporate boys' club. My father stood up so fast his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the floor. His face instantly contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. He pointed toward the door and told me this was a closed executive session. He ordered me to leave the premises immediately before he called building security to have me escorted out. Trent leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, a patronizing smile playing on his lips as he watched what he assumed would be my public humiliation. I ignored my father's shouting completely. I did not break my stride until I reached the direct center of the long mahogany table. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with heavy wax. I dropped it squarely on the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room, commanding the attention of every single board member. I looked directly at the chairman of the board, an older man named Harrison, who used to eat dinner at our house when my mother was still alive. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of emotion. I announced that before the board proceeded with any formal votes regarding executive appointments, there was a critical matter of corporate governance that required immediate attention. I stated clearly and firmly that according to the original trust documents drafted by the true founder of this company, my mother, I was entitled to a 20% voting block upon my 30th birthday. I reminded them that my birthday was exactly 2 weeks ago. I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning forward just slightly. I told them I was exercising my voting rights right now, effective immediately. And my very first official act as a major shareholder is to cast a hard, non-negotiable veto against the appointment of Trent as Chief Financial Officer. I looked straight at Trent, watching his smirk falter. I told the board that placing the financial security of a multi-million-dollar real estate firm into the hands of a man whose personal and corporate credit cards were publicly declined at a catering event the night before was not just irresponsible, it was a breach of their fiduciary duty. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Several directors began talking over one another. My father slammed his fist on the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he shouted for order. He looked toward his corporate counsel, silently demanding they find a loophole to throw me out. But before the lawyers could even open their mouths, Chantal stood up. She smoothed the front of her pristine white blazer, looking every inch the respectable, highly educated medical professional. She held up her hands, asking for calm, with a sickeningly sweet expression of deep sisterly sorrow on her face. The men at the table immediately quieted down, deferring to her calm demeanor. Chantal sighed heavily, looking at me with eyes full of manufactured pity. She addressed the board, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. She told them it broke her heart to bring private family tragedies into a professional setting, but she felt she had a moral and medical obligation to protect the company and to protect me from myself. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a manila folder. She slid a document across the table toward the chairman. It was printed on the official letterhead of a highly exclusive psychiatric clinic in Atlanta. Chantal looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the oldest board members. She told them that I had been suffering from severe undiagnosed mental health issues for years. She spun a masterful, devastating lie. She claimed that my entire career, my decision to build tech startups rather than join the traditional family business, was not ambition, but a symptom of manic, erratic behavior. She described my independent lifestyle as a series of unstable episodes. She called my confidence delusions of grandeur. She even had the audacity to frame my actions at the gala last night, where I quietly saved their reputation, as a manic outburst and a desperate cry for help. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the document on the table. She stated that according to this comprehensive psychological evaluation, which she had supposedly consulted on as a medical professional, I was experiencing a severe break from reality. She declared with absolute chilling clinical authority that I was completely mentally unfit to manage my own personal finances, let alone exercise a 20% voting block in a major corporation. She told the board that my claims about the trust were the ramblings of a sick woman who needed immediate psychiatric intervention, not a seat at the executive table. The air in the boardroom shifted instantly. The tension and outrage morphed into a heavy, suffocating blanket of condescending pity. The board members, men who inherently distrusted a young, independent black woman in the first place, eagerly grasped onto Chantal's fabricated medical authority. It gave them the perfect, respectable excuse to dismiss me entirely. They murmured in agreement, nodding solemnly at each other. They looked at me not as a threat, but as a tragic, broken liability. My father instantly adapted to the new narrative. He slumped his shoulders, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken patriarch, forced to deal with a damaged child. He looked at the chairman and whispered that this was a private family matter that they would handle delicately. Trent leaned all the way back in his leather chair, the arrogant smirk returning to his face in full force. He crossed his legs, watching me with supreme satisfaction, entirely convinced that my sister had just permanently neutralized my threat with a single forged piece of paper. Trent lets out a low, rumbling laugh that cuts through the suffocating silence of the boardroom. He leans forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He points a finger at the forged psychiatric evaluation sitting on the table between us. He proudly announces to the gathered directors that he and his legal team have already been working tirelessly behind the scenes to protect the sterling legacy from my supposed instability. He boasts loudly about the complex legal loopholes he expertly navigated to file an emergency injunction early this morning. Based entirely on Chantal's fabricated medical document, he claims to have successfully petitioned a judge to temporarily freeze my 20% voting rights, pending a full independent medical review. "You have no power here, Jasmine," Trent says, his voice dripping with patronizing faux sympathy. "We are doing this for your own good. You need to go home, get some rest, and let the adults handle the business. We will make sure your dividends are deposited so you can keep playing with your little internet hobbies, but your seat at this table is officially revoked." The sheer audacity of their gaslighting is breathtaking. They are actively attempting to paint me as a hysterical, unstable woman, weaponizing my mother's death and my perfectly justified anger to steal my birthright. My father sits at the head of the table, rubbing his temples, playing the role of the exhausted, deeply concerned patriarch to absolute perfection. The board members, a collection of older conservative men who have always viewed a young, independent black woman as an unpredictable wildcard, murmur in sympathetic agreement. They look at me not as a major shareholder, but as a tragic, broken liability that needs to be quietly and efficiently managed. I do not defend my sanity. I do not raise my voice, shout, or shed a single tear because reacting with any kind of visible emotion would only feed directly into their calculated misogynistic narrative. Instead, I turn my attention completely away from the manila folder. I ignore my sister's fake pity and my father's theatrical sighs. I focus entirely on the sleek silver laptop sitting open in front of Trent. The computer is hardwired into the ceiling projector, casting a massive luminous display of the company's central operating dashboard onto the far wall of the boardroom. The screen shows real-time revenue property management metrics, active commercial leases, and escrow account balances. It is the glowing digital heartbeat of a $31 million empire, and Trent is sitting in front of it like a child playing with a steering wheel. I ask Trent a very simple, direct question. I ask him if the newly appointed chief financial officer actually understands the digital infrastructure holding this company together. Trent scoffs, waving his hand dismissively. He tells the board that I am trying to change the subject because my mental state has been exposed. He calls my question irrelevant tech jargon that has absolutely nothing to do with the millions of dollars in physical brick-and-mortar assets they manage. I ignore his posturing and address Chairman Harrison directly. I explain that Sterling Real Estate Holdings does not actually own its digital infrastructure. I detail how the smart locks securing their luxury commercial high-rises, the automated payment portals processing millions in monthly rent, the payroll routing algorithms for hundreds of employees, and the highly encrypted financial ledgers do not belong to my father. They are strictly licensed from a private anonymous financial technology firm called Sterling Tech. Trent laughs again, louder and more abrasive this time. He tells the board that I am hallucinating again. He confidently claims that the software was built in-house 5 years ago and that I am making up imaginary shadow companies to sound important. He is so supremely confident in his absolute ignorance. I correct him gently, my voice cold and unwavering. I explain that my mother commissioned that software, yes, but my mother was a visionary who understood that the future of real estate was digital security, and she knew this boardroom was full of dinosaurs who would never understand its value. So she legally separated the intellectual property from the physical real estate assets to protect it from my father's reckless, ego-driven spending. She placed sole ownership of Sterling Tech and every single line of its source code into a private holding company. A holding company she left entirely to me. The boardroom grows deathly quiet. The condescending pity on the directors' faces is slowly, agonizingly replaced by genuine, creeping confusion. My father's posture instantly stiffens, the performance of the grieving patriarch dropping as real, tangible fear flashes across his eyes. I look down at the heavy gold watch on my wrist. I announce the time to the silent room. 9:59 in the morning. I calmly explain to the board that the enterprise license agreement powering every single computer, secure access door, and bank routing protocol in their massive portfolio operates on a strict 5-year renewal cycle. I mention that because Trent fired the senior IT director during his very first week to aggressively cut operational overhead costs. Nobody was monitoring the system administration emails. Nobody saw the automated warnings hitting the server. Nobody realized that the digital backbone of their $31 million operation required manual renewal by the tech firm's sole proprietor. I look directly into Trent's arrogant, widening eyes and casually mention that their operating license expired at exactly 10 in the morning today. Trent's face flushes with sudden, violently defensive anger. He slams his hand on the table, calling me a liar. He insists that the systems are perfectly fine, that the company is secure, and that I am just a pathetic, desperate woman trying to claw back power I never deserved. He turns aggressively back to his laptop, determined to prove me wrong in front of the entire executive board. He wants to show them the dashboard to prove the numbers are still flowing, to prove my words are just another symptom of my supposed madness. Trent furiously clicks his mouse, but the projector screen behind him suddenly flashes a red, "Access denied" error. Trent stared at the glaring red letters on the projection screen, the color rapidly draining from his face until he looked like a panicked, cornered child. He hammered the enter key, the frantic plastic clicking echoing sharply in the suddenly silent boardroom. Nothing happened. He slammed his palm against the keyboard, desperately hitting refresh, but the access denied message remained absolute. It stood as a massive, unblinking monument to his sheer incompetence. Then the real chaos started. The digital dominoes began to fall, ripping through the corporate infrastructure at the speed of light. First, the automated smart blinds lining the boardroom windows whirred to a sudden grinding halt, halfway up the glass, trapping the room in harsh, uneven sunlight. The synchronized digital clocks on the walls flickered wildly before going entirely blank. A heartbeat later, the phones started ringing. Not just one line, but every single desk phone in the executive suite began a synchronized shrill blare as automated panic protocols triggered across the building. The blackout was not localized to this room. It was systemic, absolute, and utterly catastrophic. I watched the horrible realization wash over the faces of my father's hand-picked board members. Sterling Real Estate Holdings was suddenly blind, deaf, and functionally paralyzed. Every digital lock on every commercial high-rise we owned across the state was now frozen in its current state. The automated payment portals processing millions in monthly rent from our residential tenants were completely offline. The internal communication servers, the maintenance dispatch logs, the financial routing algorithms, the entire lifeblood of a $31 million empire had just been pinched shut. My father did not look at the dead screen. He did not look at Trent, the man he had just trusted with the keys to the kingdom. He looked directly at me. His face was no longer the composed, charismatic mask of a corporate titan. It was twisted into a snarl of pure, unfiltered rage. He slammed both of his heavy hands flat on the mahogany table, the force rattling the crystal water glasses and spilling ice onto the polished wood. He screamed that I was a thief. His voice cracked with the sheer volume reverberating painfully off the glass walls. He accused me of being a malicious hacker, of committing corporate cyber terrorism, of intentionally sabotaging my own family out of petty vindictive jealousy because I could not handle being passed over. He did not care about the legal reality that my mother had explicitly willed the tech holding company to me years ago. He did not care that his golden boy son-in-law had failed to perform a basic mandatory administrative check on his very first day as chief financial officer. To a man like Jeremiah Sterling, accountability was a completely foreign concept. He desperately needed a scapegoat to deflect from his monumental failure in leadership, and I had been conditioned to play that role my entire life. He pointed a shaking finger inches from my face, bellowing that I had finally crossed the line from a difficult, ungrateful daughter to a common criminal. He demanded I restore the network access immediately, framing it not as a negotiation between corporate shareholders, but as an aggressive order from a father to a disobedient child. He swore that if I did not fix the screens right this second, he would make sure I spent the rest of my life locked in a concrete cell. I remained perfectly still, letting his furious tirade wash over me without blinking. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I simply shook my head, my expression carved from ice. I told him that I did not owe a free multi-million-dollar software operating license to a corporation that had just illegally frozen my voting rights using a forged psychiatric evaluation. I informed him that Sterling Tech did not do business with fraudulent enterprises. Seeing that his intimidation tactics were completely failing, my father reached for the heavy brass intercom on the center console. He bypassed his executive assistant and connected the line directly to the main lobby security desk. He barked an order for 2 armed guards to report to the boardroom immediately. He instructed them to remove me from the premises permanently, using whatever physical force was necessary. He was legally locking me out of the very building my mother had purchased with her own blood, sweat, and capital. As the heavy glass doors swung open and the 2 burly security guards stepped tentatively into the tense room, Trent finally stood up. The initial shock of his failure had worn off rapidly, replaced by a cold, venomous spite. He walked around the massive table, stopping just inches from where I stood, while the guards waited for my father's confirming nod. Trent leaned in close, his expensive, heavy cologne mixing with the sharp, sour scent of his own nervous sweat. He lowered his voice to a harsh, guttural whisper, ensuring the older board members sitting nearby could not hear his threats. He told me I had made a massive, fatal miscalculation. He reminded me with a smug curl of his lip that he was heavily connected in the elite Atlanta banking sector. He bragged that his former fraternity brothers ran the regional branches of every major financial institution in the city, the very same men he golfed with every single weekend. He hissed that I might temporarily hold the software keys to this building, but he held the institutional financial levers to my entire life. He promised me with absolute terrifying conviction that he would use every single favor, every backdoor connection, and every ounce of his unearned privilege to ensure I was completely financially ruined by sunset. He vowed to drain me dry, starve me out of my own inheritance, and happily watch me crawl back to this boardroom, begging for a fraction of my trust fund. I did not flinch. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response, a denial, or a counter threat. I simply held his gaze for one long, dismissive second, then turned my back on him. I squared my shoulders, kept my head perfectly high, and walked directly toward the waiting security guards. I did not let them touch my arms. I walked out of the boardroom under my own power, leaving them sealed inside a digital tomb of their own making. The walk through the executive suite was a surreal, chaotic experience. Administrative assistants were frantically running between cubicles carrying massive stacks of printed paper. Senior managers were yelling in frustration into their personal cell phones. The entire corporate machine was experiencing a total, unmitigated operational meltdown. I walked past the grand corner office that should have rightfully been mine, past the beautiful oil portraits of my mother hanging on the hallway walls, and stepped into the elevator with the two silent, uncomfortable guards. We descended to the ground floor in total silence. The grand marble lobby was just as disastrous as the upper floors. Angry commercial tenants were arguing fiercely with the front desk staff about disabled keycards and locked stairwells. External vendors were stranded near the loading docks, entirely unable to process their digital delivery receipts. I walked straight through the sliding glass doors and stepped out into the bright, humid Atlanta morning air. The heavy automated security doors locked behind me with a definitive heavy click. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the sudden sharp adrenaline crash hitting my system. I had actually done it. I had pulled the trigger and brought the empire to its knees. But as I reached the edge of the sidewalk to hail a ride home, my phone began to vibrate aggressively in my blazer pocket. It was not a single standard notification. It was a continuous, frantic, mechanical buzzing against my hip. I pulled the device out, the screen glaring brightly in the morning sun. I opened my primary banking application, expecting to see my standard balances and transfer the funds I needed for the upcoming legal fight. Instead, the screen was entirely flooded with severe red alert banners. Trent was not bluffing. The push notifications cascaded down my screen one after another in rapid succession. The messages indicated that every single personal checking account, savings account, and credit line I held, connected to his bank's regional network, had just been frozen and locked down under suspicion of severe financial fraud. The relentless pounding started just before 7 in the morning. It was not the polite, hesitant knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the aggressive, heavy-fisted hammering of someone who felt entirely entitled to knock down the door. I had barely slept in the 48 hours since I walked out of the Sterling Real Estate Holdings building. Living with entirely frozen financial assets was a jarring, terrifying reality. My credit cards had been unceremoniously declined at the corner grocery store yesterday evening. My automatic rent payment scheduled for the first of the month had violently bounced back to a frozen checking account. I was surviving on the $300 in emergency cash I kept tucked in my bedside drawer, meticulously rationing every cup of coffee and piece of toast. I pulled on my heavy silk robe, the cold hardwood floor chilling my bare feet, and walked down the short hallway of my apartment. I did not ask who it was. I looked through the brass peephole and felt my stomach instantly tighten into a cold, hard knot. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Trent stood in the hallway flanked by my sister Chantal and a man I immediately recognized as Mr. Aris, the notoriously ruthless property manager of my building complex. Trent was wearing a bespoke, perfectly pressed navy suit, looking completely out of place in the modest, dimly lit residential corridor. He looked incredibly rested, radiating the toxic, manic energy of a man who believed he had just flawlessly checkmated his only rival. Mr. Aris stood slightly behind him, holding a thick metal clipboard against his chest, a greasy, complicit smirk plastered across his face. Trent did not offer a greeting. He did not even wait for me to fully open the door. He immediately thrust a legally binding bright yellow piece of paper directly into my face. He told me to read it carefully. He proudly announced that it was an immediate, unconditional notice of eviction. I looked at the paper, scanning the bold black lettering, then up at his gloating eyes. I asked him, my voice dangerously calm and deliberately flat, how exactly a chief financial officer with zero ties to my residential building had the authority to serve me with an eviction notice at 7 in the morning. Trent threw his head back and laughed, a loud, abrasive sound that echoed down the quiet hallway, disturbing the morning silence. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice and the absolute power he believed he wielded. He explained that high-level business was all about leverage, capital, and relationships. He boasted that his parent bank, the exact same financial institution where he had seamlessly orchestrated the freezing of my personal accounts, had quietly and aggressively acquired the underlying commercial mortgage to this entire apartment complex late yesterday afternoon. He bragged about calling in heavy favors, bypassing standard regulatory wait times, and utilizing his elite fraternity connections to fast-track the acquisition specifically to target me. He pointed a manicured finger at the yellow paper, trembling slightly in his hand. He told me that according to the fine print of my lease contract, a lease his bank now legally owned and controlled with absolute authority, a failed payment linked to an active fraud investigation triggered an immediate non-negotiable default clause. He sneered, stating that because my accounts were frozen, my unpaid dues meant I was no longer a tenant. I was officially a trespassing squatter in his property. Before I could even process the sheer vindictive legality of his corporate maneuvering, Chantal pushed her way to the front of the group. She was holding her latest model smartphone up high, the camera lens pointed directly at my face, the recording light blinking a steady, malicious red. She was fully dressed in designer activewear, a matching pastel set that cost more than my monthly rent, looking as though she had just finished a private luxury Pilates session before deciding to come ruin my life. She aggressively panned the camera past my shoulder, deliberately capturing the interior of my apartment. Chantal let out a sharp theatrical gasp of manufactured disgust. She began to narrate to the camera, speaking directly to her invisible audience of wealthy socialites, country club wives, and gossiping family friends. She relentlessly mocked the size of my living room, calling it a claustrophobic, depressing little shoebox unfit for a sterling. She zoomed in on my vintage velvet sofa, a piece I had spent months carefully restoring with my own hands, and instantly dismissed it as cheap salvaged garbage. She asked the camera in a tone dripping with toxic faux concern how the supposedly brilliant, independent daughter of Jeremiah Sterling could possibly live in such pathetic squalor. This was exactly how Chantal operated. I vividly remembered being 16, standing in the grand foyer of our childhood mansion, in a dress I had proudly sewn myself for a school dance. Chantal had stood on the grand staircase filming me on her digital camera, laughing hysterically and asking our mother why I always insisted on looking like a desperate charity case. She fed on public humiliation. It was her absolute favorite, most reliable weapon. She lowered the phone just a fraction, looking at me with eyes completely devoid of any sisterly affection. She told me with a sickeningly sweet, venomous tone that my little rebellion was officially over. She instructed me to go pack up my cheap, pathetic little clothes into black trash bags. She suggested with a vicious, mocking giggle that I should probably start looking up directions to the nearest downtown homeless shelter. She tapped her screen, reminding me that I had less than an hour before Mr. Aris and his maintenance crew physically dragged my belongings out onto the curb for the entire city to see. Trent stepped forwards again, physically invading my personal space, intentionally forcing me to take a half step back into my own entryway. He completely dropped the jovial boasting tone. His voice turned hard, flat, and absolute. He told me that this was exactly what happened when someone tried to play games with the Sterling Empire. He said that I had humiliated him in front of the executive board, and in return he was going to strip away every single piece of stability, dignity, and independence I had ever built for myself. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of total, unadulterated victory. He delivered his ultimate demand. He told me that I had exactly one option left to avoid sleeping on the cold concrete tonight. He ordered me to pick up my phone, call our father, and beg for his absolute, unconditional forgiveness. He demanded that I officially sign over the Sterling Tech Holding Company and legally surrender my 20% voting rights directly to him. He promised that if I cried, if I sincerely apologized, and if I surrendered completely, they might graciously allow me to keep my little shoebox apartment. Trent crossed his arms over his chest. Chantal held her phone perfectly steady, the red recording light blinking rhythmically in the dim hallway. Mr. Aris tapped his silver pen against his clipboard. They stood there, an unholy trinity of corporate greed and familial betrayal completely blocking my exit. They stared at me with absolute certainty, fully expecting me to break down. They were waiting for the tears to fall, waiting for my knees to buckle, waiting for me to surrender to my father's ultimate authority, just like everyone else always did. The silence in the small entryway stretched out thick and heavy. Trent, Chantal, and Mr. Aris stood like statues, fully expecting the facade to crack. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse, the desperate tears, the frantic dialing of my father's private number to beg for mercy. When I simply continued to stare at them, with a face carved from stone, Trent grew impatient. He stepped across the threshold, his polished leather shoes sinking into my vintage rug, effectively invading my sanctuary. He began to pace the length of my living room, running his hand over the back of my armchair with a proprietary air. He adjusted his silk tie and launched into a monologue so deeply patronizing it was almost a caricature of corporate arrogance. He adopted the tone of a disappointed professor lecturing a slow student. He told me that I needed to understand how the real world operated. He called the corporate sector a ruthless shark tank, a place where idealism and little internet startups were quickly swallowed whole by people who actually understood leverage. He chuckled, shaking his head, as if my attempt to challenge him at the board meeting was a cute, childish mistake. "You tried to play a game you do not have the stomach for, Jasmine," Trent said, his voice echoing off my apartment walls. He paused by my bookshelf, picking up a framed photograph of my mother and examining it with casual disrespect. "You need to learn your place. You need to leave the complex finance stuff, the heavy lifting, to the big boys. We actually know how to manage assets without throwing emotional temper tantrums in the middle of executive meetings." He set the photograph face down on the shelf. The sound of the wood hitting the glass was sharp and deliberate. He turned back to me, his expression hardening into genuine malice. He told me that my mother, the woman who had bled to build the Sterling Empire from the ground up, would be utterly ashamed of my failure today. He claimed she would be disgusted to see her daughter acting like a hysterical liability, squandering her legacy out of petty jealousy because I could not accept that a seasoned professional was brought in to save the company. It was a calculated, vicious strike aimed directly at my deepest vulnerability. He wanted to use my mother's memory as a weapon to finally break my composure. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice to defend my mother's honor or my own sanity. I did not take the bait. The sheer blinding audacity of a man who had held his position for less than 48 hours, telling me to leave the heavy lifting to the big boys, was almost fascinating. I looked at him not with anger, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly loud, unintelligent insect trapped in a jar. I simply turned on my heel, turning my back on his pathetic victory speech, and walked directly into my bedroom. Chantal followed immediately, right on my heels, the red recording light of her phone glaring in the dim hallway. She was not going to miss a single second of my supposed humiliation. I ignored her completely. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a single structured weekender bag. It was crafted from smooth, unmarked midnight blue leather, devoid of any flashy logos, monogrammed prints, or recognizable hardware. It was a bespoke piece from an ultra-exclusive Milanese artisan, a bag that required a private introduction and a 2-year waiting list just to commission. Chantal zoomed her camera in on the bag, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that grated against my eardrums. She narrated to her invisible audience, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She told the camera to look at the tragic reality of my situation. She pointed out the lack of designer branding on my luggage, loudly declaring it a cheap plastic knockoff probably bought at a discount flea market. "Look at this," Chantal sneered, stepping closer to ensure the microphone picked up every cruel word. The great, independent Jasmine Sterling reduced to packing her cheap synthetic clothes into a fake bag because she refuses to apologize to her own father. It is just sad. You need to pack your things quickly and go find a local homeless shelter, Jasmine. Maybe they have a bed open for a failed tech entrepreneur. I methodically opened the suitcase, moving with practiced, unhurried precision. I did not pack clothes. I did not pack shoes or toiletries. I went directly to the hidden floor safe bolted beneath my desk. I spun the combination lock, pulled the heavy steel door open, and extracted 3 items. The original notarized trust ledgers my mother had secretly secured for me before her death. 2 heavily encrypted military-grade solid-state hard drives containing the entire unalterable source code for Sterling Tech, and a single heavy black file folder containing the digital access keys to the offshore accounts Trent and his banking fraternity brothers could not even begin to trace, let alone freeze. I placed the documents and the drives into the weekender bag, zipped the smooth leather shut, and picked it up by the reinforced handles. Chantal was still talking, still spinning her vicious narrative, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just packed the literal blueprints to our family empire into a bag she thought was synthetic trash. I walked back out into the living room. Trent was standing by the front door with Mr. Aris checking his watch with an expression of supreme boredom. He looked up as I approached, his chest puffed out, fully expecting me to finally deliver the tearful apology he had demanded. He expected me to drop to my knees and beg for my father's intervention to save my apartment. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out the heavy brass keys to the apartment. I did not hand them to him. I did not place them on the entry table. I flicked my wrist and tossed the heavy metal ring directly at his chest. Trent gasped in surprise, fumbling awkwardly to catch the keys before they hit the floor. He looked up at me, his arrogant smirk instantly replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, razor-sharp whisper that easily cut through the silence of the room. I told him he could keep the apartment. I told him he was going to need a place to sleep when the federal investigators seized his house. Trent laughed, a harsh barking sound that completely lacked genuine humor. He dismissed my warning as a pathetic, desperate bluff from a woman who had just realized she had lost everything. He adjusted his expensive cufflinks, sneering that federal investigators did not waste their valuable time on simple, legally binding lease violations. I adjusted my grip on the smooth leather handles of my weekender bag, my expression remaining completely unreadable. I told him that in his manic, ego-driven rush to bypass standard regulatory wait times and weaponize his bank's capital against me, he had completely ignored the mandatory institutional due diligence protocols. I instructed him to look very closely at the building's commercial structural disclosures, specifically the Addendum C that he had so confidently signed away just hours ago. I kept my voice dangerously low, forcing him to lean in to hear the exact details of his monumental failure. I explained that the entire south wing of this residential complex was currently sinking into an unstable, heavily eroded bedrock foundation. I detailed the severe, undocumented black mold infestation actively festering in the sub-basement ventilation system, a direct environmental hazard that was already triggering a massive multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit from the lower-level commercial tenants. I informed him that a municipal condemnation order had been quietly filed with the city zoning board just last Tuesday. By aggressively acquiring this specific commercial mortgage to enact his petty, short-sighted revenge, Trent had not bought a valuable asset. He had knowingly anchored a radioactive, legally condemned liability directly onto his bank's quarterly balance sheet. The mandatory environmental remediation and structural repair costs alone were going to exceed the initial purchase price by a factor of 10. Trent's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a millisecond, a brief flash of genuine corporate panic widening his eyes before his towering arrogance aggressively overcompensated. He waved his hand dismissively loudly, declaring that my desperate fabricated lies were not going to stop the eviction process. Chantal ignored the financial reality completely. She was far too absorbed in her own manufactured victory. She dropped her oversized designer tote bag directly onto my pristine kitchen island and eagerly pulled out a chilled bottle of vintage Dom Perignon. She had actually brought champagne and 3 crystal flutes to celebrate my sudden destitution. The heavy cork popped with a sharp, violent crack echoing loudly against the high ceilings of the apartment. The expensive champagne foamed over the lip of the green bottle, spilling in a sticky, careless puddle directly onto my polished hardwood floors. Chantal giggled maniacally, pouring generous glasses for Trent and a remarkably eager Mr. Aries. They were practically vibrating with victorious adrenaline, raising their crystal flutes to toast my absolute ruin in the middle of my own living room. They were a pathetic, chaotic spectacle of unearned privilege and malicious greed. I did not give them another word. I did not offer a defense, a tear, or a final plea for familial mercy. I simply turned around, stepped firmly over the threshold, and pulled the heavy, solid core door shut behind me. The loud metallic click of the deadbolt engaging sealed them inside their own foolishness, instantly cutting off the sound of their celebratory laughter. I walked down the long, carpeted corridor, the morning silence a stark welcome contrast to the toxic circus I had just left behind. My heart rate was completely normal. My breathing was perfectly steady and deep. I pressed the illuminated call button for the elevator and watched the digital floor numbers slowly descend. I was technically stepping out into the humid Atlanta morning with absolutely no access to my personal checking accounts, effectively locked out of my family's corporate empire, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and a single leather bag. Yet standing in that quiet hallway, I had never felt more incredibly, dangerously powerful. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside the empty, mirrored cabin. As the elevator began its rapid, stomach-dropping descent to the ground floor lobby, my phone began to vibrate in my blazer pocket. It was not the frantic, mechanical buzzing of the banking fraud alerts from earlier. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, indicating an incoming call on my heavily encrypted private secondary line. I slid the device out and glanced at the bright screen. It was Marcus, the senior managing director of my private wealth management team. I answered the call, lifting the phone to my ear as the elevator plummeted downward. Marcus did not bother with a polite morning greeting or corporate small talk. He knew exactly what day today was, and he knew exactly what we had been meticulously engineering in absolute secrecy for the past 18 months. His voice was practically humming with intense professional excitement, the kind of restrained euphoria that only comes from executing a flawless multi-billion-dollar financial maneuver. He told me that the Securities and Exchange Commission had just officially finalized their comprehensive review. The final complex regulatory hurdles had been completely and legally cleared without a single red flag. The ink was drying on the digital signatures at this exact moment. He confirmed, his voice dropping to a low, triumphant octave, that our highly aggressive shadow acquisition strategy had been executed with absolute terrifying perfection. The necessary capital had been moved, the majority voting shares had been secured, and the existing board members had been completely outmaneuvered before they even realized they were under attack. He proudly informed me that Sterling Capital, the ruthless, hyper-aggressive venture capital firm I had secretly built entirely independent of my father's outdated real estate holdings, had just officially finalized its most ambitious hostile takeover to date. I had taken the initial modest seed money my mother had quietly left me in an offshore trust and meticulously multiplied it over the past decade, building a shadow empire that now financially dwarfed Sterling real estate holdings by orders of magnitude. The target of our massive covert acquisition was not some random struggling corporate entity. It was Vanguard Financial. It was the exact parent banking institution where Trent held his prestigious, heavily leveraged chief financial officer position. It was the very same regional bank that had just illegally frozen every single one of my personal checking accounts and rapidly purchased my apartment building's mortgage to orchestrate my morning eviction. I listened to Marcus detail the immediate transfer of institutional power, outlining the aggressive restructuring protocols we were going to implement before the markets opened on Monday. We were going to systematically liquidate the entire regional executive tier, starting with the immediate, unceremonious termination of the chief financial officer. A slow, predatory smile finally spread across my face as the elevator doors chimed and opened to the sunlit lobby. Trent genuinely thought he had successfully cornered me by using his banking connections as a blunt weapon. He had strutted into my living room believing he was an untouchable predator in a corporate shark tank. He had absolutely no idea that as of 5 minutes ago, my hidden firm legally owned the entire ocean. I owned his parent bank. I owned his ironclad executive employment contract. I owned the commercial mortgage to the very building he was currently standing in, popping champagne. I was no longer the disgraced daughter being unceremoniously thrown out onto the street. I was now his ultimate undisputed boss. 7 days is an absolute eternity in the financial sector. In exactly 1 week, the silent, violent shockwaves of my hostile takeover had completely leveled the regional banking hierarchy. Yet tonight, shielded by my father's blind ignorance and the remaining capital of sterling real estate holdings, Trent was still desperately playing the role of a corporate king. The Atlanta Heritage Real Estate Auction was the undisputed crown jewel event of the Southern elite. It was an opulent, invitation-only bloodbath where the city's oldest money gathered under the guise of high society philanthropy to ruthlessly carve up prime commercial acreage. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a sea of tailored tuxedos, dripping diamonds, and the hushed, arrogant murmurs of multi-million-dollar deals being struck over imported caviar, the illusion of power. Trent and Chantal were seated dead center in the front row, exactly where the event photographers and society reporters could not possibly miss them. They were putting on a sickeningly transparent performance of unchecked wealth and total victory. Trent was practically vibrating with a manic, overcompensated arrogance. He held the gold-leafed sterling real estate bidding paddle like a royal scepter, aggressively throwing my father's capital at every mid-tier commercial lot that crossed the block. He was overpaying wildly, driving up prices just to force older, more established developers to fold. He was desperately trying to announce to the room that he was the new undisputed alpha of the Atlanta property market. Chantal sat beside him, completely draped in heavy, ostentatious diamonds. She was leaning into his shoulders, soaking up the flashes of the cameras, acting as the perfect, adoring wife of a corporate titan. Whenever Trent won a bid, she would dramatically clap her hands, looking around the room with a smug, territorial glare to ensure everyone was properly witnessing their ascension. They genuinely believed they had successfully excised me from the family lineage. They thought my complete silence over the past 7 days was the silence of a defeated homeless woman who had finally been starved into submission. They were profoundly mistaken. The ascent, I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom precisely 45 minutes after the first gavel fell. I did not approach the general registration desk. I did not wear the conservative, understated business attire my father had always demanded I wear to ensure I faded quietly into his background. I wore a custom-tailored, razor-sharp crimson suit designed by an independent Milanese house, paired with a single flawless diamond tennis necklace that my mother had secretly left in my private trust. The ensemble radiated an icy, untouchable authority. I did not look like an employee. I looked like an owner. The event director, a man who had notoriously ignored me for years whenever I attended these events in my father's shadow, immediately recognized the heavy black titanium card I held in my hand. He bypassed the entire line of waiting millionaires, bowing his head slightly, and personally escorted me to the private velvet-lined staircase tucked away in the corner of the room. I ascended directly to the VIP balcony. This was not general seating. This was a glass-paneled suspended mezzanine reserved exclusively for institutional owners, massive corporate sponsors, and the anonymous billionaires who preferred to watch the feeding frenzy from a safe, elevated distance. The air up here was quieter, the champagne was infinitely better, and the view of the floor below was absolute. I stepped up to the edge of the thick glass partition flanked by Marcus and two senior partners from my newly revealed venture capital firm, Sterling Capital. I placed my hands flat on the cool glass and looked directly down at the front row, the realization. It took Chantal less than 3 minutes to feel the shift in the room's energy. She was addicted to attention, constantly scanning the crowd to see who was admiring her designer gown. Her eyes swept over the general seating, drifted past the press pool, and finally moved upward to the exclusive balcony tier. The crystal champagne flute stopped dead just an inch from her glossy lips. Her jaw literally dropped, her perfectly contoured face instantly draining of all color, until she looked entirely, completely ashen. She blinked rapidly, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock, as she stared up at the sister she had ruthlessly ordered to pack her bags for a homeless shelter just 1 week ago. I was not standing in a breadline. I was standing in the most exclusive, expensive square footage in the entire building, looking down at her with an expression of total dismissive boredom. Chantal frantically slapped Trent on the arm, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking noisily against his tailored suit jacket. She pointed a shaking manicured finger up at the glass balcony. Trent whipped his head around. His chest puffed out in irritation at the interruption. His eyes followed her pointing finger and locked directly onto mine. I watched the arrogant, booming confidence instantly evaporate from his face. For a fleeting, beautiful second, Trent looked exactly like a cornered prey animal. His mind was violently struggling to process the visual data. It made absolutely no logical sense to him. A woman with frozen bank accounts and a fresh eviction notice could not bypass the security detail of the VIP mezzanine. I did not offer them a smile. I did not wave. I simply held Trent's panicked gaze, tilted my head a fraction of an inch, and lifted my glass of sparkling water in a silent, chillingly cold toast to his impending destruction. Trent aggressively turned his back to the balcony. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He furiously whispered something into Chantal's ear, likely convincing himself that I had somehow conned my way upstairs, or that I was simply a guest of one of his banking rivals. He violently adjusted his tie, his posture rigid with sudden suffocating insecurity. He desperately needed to reassert his dominance to prove to the room and to himself that he was still the man in charge. The heavy wooden gavel cracked sharply against the podium, instantly cutting through the low hum of the ballroom. The head auctioneer stepped up to the microphone, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. He announced the final highly coveted property of the evening. It was not a standard commercial lot. It was the historic 60-acre downtown industrial rail yard. It was a massive multi-billion-dollar development project that every major real estate firm in the Southeast had been viciously fighting over for 3 years. It was the exact property my father had promised the Sterling board he would secure to guarantee the company's dominance for the next decade. Winning this bid was Trent's ultimate test. The starting bid was announced at an astronomical $50 million. A collective hushed murmur rippled through the general seating. Trent did not even wait for the auctioneer to finish speaking. Desperate to humiliate me, desperate to project absolute financial invincibility, he immediately thrust his gold-leafed paddle high into the air. He squared his shoulders, puffing his chest out for the cameras, looking incredibly blindly smug. The auctioneer barely had time to acknowledge Trent's opening $50 million bid before I casually raised my sleek black paddle from the shadows of the VIP balcony. The sharp, amplified voice of the auctioneer immediately redirected upward. He announced a counterbid from the private mezzanine. Trent's neck snapped backward, his eyes straining against the harsh spotlights of the ballroom to see who dared challenge his highly publicized coronation. He could not see me clearly through the tinted glass partition, but the sheer disrespect of the immediate counterbid made his jaw clench. He aggressively thrust his paddle into the air again, adding another $2 million. I did not even wait for the auctioneer to process the number. I raised my paddle again. Trent shot out of his chair, his face flushing a deep mottled red. He barked out a completely new figure, trying to physically intimidate a phantom opponent hiding above him. The ballroom fell dead silent. The polite high society whispers evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. This was no longer a charity auction. It was a public execution. I kept my arm resting comfortably on the glass railing, raising the black paddle with the rhythmic mechanical precision of a metronome. Trent bid 70 million. I countered immediately. He pushed it to 85. I countered before the auctioneer could even take a breath. Trent was rapidly blowing past the authorized sterling corporate acquisition budget, dipping dangerously into heavily leveraged credit lines that he had no business touching. Heavy beads of nervous sweat broke out across Trent's forehead, catching the glare of the crystal chandeliers. He was practically panting, his tailored suit suddenly looking restrictive and suffocating. Beside him, Chantal had entirely lost her smug composure. Her manicured hands were gripping Trent's forearm like a vice, her knuckles turning bone white. She was frantically pulling at his sleeve violently, whispering in his ear to stop, fully realizing that he was publicly hemorrhaging their financial future on a single piece of undeveloped land. Trent violently shook her off. His fragile, toxic ego simply could not allow him to lose in front of the entire Atlanta elite. He raised his paddle one last agonizing time, his voice cracking slightly, as he announced an astronomical, completely ruinous figure that effectively drained every ounce of liquid capital sterling real estate possessed. The auctioneer looked up at the balcony, the heavy wooden gavel hovering in his hand, asking if the private bidder wished to respond. I pressed a button on the intercom console mounted to the glass partition, connecting my voice directly to the ballroom's main audio feed. I did not increase the bid by a standard polite increment. I spoke with absolute terrifying clarity, my voice echoing off the marble pillars. I increased the final offer by a staggering $5 million in a single devastating jump. Furthermore, I instructed the auctioneer to bypass the standard escrow protocols, announcing to the completely paralyzed room that I was paying the entire balance immediately in cash. The gavel slammed down with the finality of a gunshot. The property was mine. Trent collapsed backward into his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his own empire burn to the ground. I did not linger to watch them suffer. I turned my back on the ballroom floor, walked out of the VIP suite, and descended the private marble staircase toward the grand lobby. The moment my heels hit the polished marble of the ground floor, a heavy hand violently grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, stepping out of the physical grasp with practiced ease. Jeremiah Sterling stood blocking the main exit. My father was no longer trying to maintain his mask of a sophisticated corporate patriarch. He was practically vibrating with pure, unfiltered rage, his breathing heavy, his face twisted into a mask of absolute humiliation. He had clearly been watching the entire spectacle from the lobby monitors, helplessly witnessing his son-in-law publicly gut the family company. He did not yell. He knew there were reporters and high-level executives lingering nearby. Instead, he crowded into my personal space, his imposing frame, trying to physically intimidate me into submission. He reached inside his tailored tuxedo jacket, pulled out a leather-bound checkbook, and furiously scribbled across a heavy, watermarked check. He ripped the paper from the binding and shoved it aggressively against my chest. He ordered me to take the money. He told me it was a clean $100,000 in hush money. His voice was a harsh, guttural hiss, dripping with absolute contempt. He demanded that I take the check, go straight to the airport, and leave Atlanta tonight. He explicitly ordered me to permanently disappear from their lives and stop embarrassing the Sterling name with my vindictive, psychotic stunts. He leaned in closer, the sour smell of scotch and nervous adrenaline radiating off him. He delivered a chilling, absolute warning. He promised that if I refused to take the money and vanish, he would personally ensure that my mother's entire legacy was permanently erased from the corporate archives. He swore he would use his legal team to bury me in endless litigation, aggressively threatening to sue me for high-level corporate espionage and financial terrorism. He vowed to lock me in a concrete cell for the rest of my life. I looked down at the fluttering piece of paper in his hand. I looked at the 6 zeros scrawled in his familiar, aggressive handwriting. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a quiet sound of absolute, unadulterated amusement. I reached out and took the check from his hand between my index and middle fingers. I held his furious gaze without blinking. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I tore the check perfectly in half. I let the pieces fall exactly where we stood, the expensive paper fluttering uselessly onto the polished marble floor. I calmly adjusted the collar of my crimson suit and informed Jeremiah that he was severely miscalculating his current financial reality. I told him that the massive multi-million-dollar cash payment I had just wired upstairs to secure the downtown rail yard did not come from my personal savings. I explained, speaking slowly so he could absorb every single devastating syllable, that the money was drawn directly from the extreme ruinous penalty fees his own corporation had incurred exactly 24 hours ago. I watched the arrogant anger in his eyes slowly morph into profound confusion. I clarified that Sterling Real Estate Holdings had defaulted on a massive high-interest bridge loan yesterday afternoon. It was a desperate, toxic loan they had been absolutely forced to take out just to cover their daily operating costs because someone had completely shut down their internal software network. I smiled a cold, predatory expression. I thanked him for funding my new acquisition. Behind my father, the grand ballroom doors swung open. Trent stumbled out into the lobby looking physically ill, his phone clutched desperately in his hand. He had clearly overheard the last part of my sentence. He frantically swiped at his screen, desperately trying to log into his bank's secure executive portal to verify the catastrophic capital drain I had just described. I watched the exact moment his world ended. Trent's face turned the color of old ash. He aggressively tapped his screen, his hands shaking violently, but the system repeatedly denied him. The massive, glaring red letters on his phone indicated that his administrative access had been completely revoked. He had been permanently locked out of his own banking portal. Jeremiah looked back at Trent's horrifying, panicked expression, then turned back to me. The reality of the financial walls rapidly closing in around him finally shattered his last remaining shred of sanity. Blinded by absolute desperate rage, he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He screamed that this was an illegal, hostile theft. He vowed at the top of his lungs to drag me into federal court, to ruthlessly strip away every single asset I possessed, and to legally crush me until I had absolutely nothing left. He roared his threats into the echoing lobby, promising a brutal, unrelenting legal war, completely unaware that his desperate, furious vows were leading us directly back to the very moment this entire story began. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Superior Court shut with a dull, echoing thud, snapping us directly back into the present reality. The frantic adrenaline of the St. Regis auction lobby dissolved, replaced by the sterile, hyper-formal atmosphere of the courtroom. My father had kept his furious promise. He had dragged me before a judge within 72 hours, utilizing every corrupt political favor and expedited legal channel his remaining influence could buy. Jeremiah Sterling stood at the plaintiff's table, his bespoke charcoal suit immaculately pressed. He was leaning forward, resting his hands casually on the polished mahogany, sharing a quiet, condescending chuckle with Judge Harrison Vance. They were old friends, members of the same exclusive golf clubs, men who traded municipal zoning favors over expensive bourbon. Trent sat beside my father, his posture radiating a toxic, unearned confidence. He smirked at me across the aisle, fully believing the legal machinery of Atlanta was about to crush me into dust. My father cleared his throat, adopting the performative, weary tone of a benevolent patriarch forced to discipline a hysterical child. He addressed the judge, weaving a masterful, completely fabricated narrative. He claimed that I was a deeply disturbed, disgruntled former employee, suffering from a severe psychological break. He painted me as a destitute, jealous daughter who was fabricating elaborate financial delusions because I simply could not handle being legally terminated from the family enterprise. He dramatically pointed a finger at me, demanding that the court immediately sign an emergency injunction to liquidate whatever pitiful, meager personal assets I possessed. He claimed it was absolutely necessary to cover the extensive reputational and operational damages I had maliciously inflicted upon Sterling Real Estate Holdings. Judge Vance nodded sympathetically, a patronizing smile stretching across his face. He looked down at me from his elevated bench, adjusting his reading glasses with an air of supreme boredom. He asked me if I had any sort of rational defense to present before he signed my father's emergency liquidation order, warning me that he had absolutely no patience for domestic theatrics in his courtroom. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or offer an emotional, desperate plea for justice. I stood up slowly, smoothing the sharp lapels of my tailored blazer, and looked directly into the judge's eyes. I told him that I did not bring theatrics to courtrooms. I brought receipts. I picked up a thick, heavy black folder from the defendant's table. It was the exact same folder I had extracted from my hidden floor safe the morning Trent tried to evict me. I walked deliberately across the plush carpet, the sharp click of my heels breaking the stifling silence of the room. I bypassed the bailiff entirely and slid the heavy, unredacted corporate filings directly across the polished surface of the judge's bench. I instructed Judge Vance to review the primary incorporation documents, specifically the unredacted master ownership ledgers that I had just legally unsealed. The judge let out a heavy, irritated sigh, treating my documents as a nuisance. He flipped open the black cover, his eyes scanning the first page with casual dismissal. Then he stopped. He blinked hard, his brow furrowing in confusion. He flipped to the second page, tracing his finger along the notarized federal banking seals and the verified offshore holding company chains. The condescending smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden rigid tension. He flipped to the third page, the master ownership declaration for a private equity firm that practically controlled the municipal bond market of the entire state. I stood perfectly still, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, razor-sharp register that carried effortlessly to every corner of the room. I announced to the court, and to the two men staring at my back, that I was not a destitute former employee. I stated clearly and unequivocally that my legal name was J.L. Sterling, the sole founder and primary executive of Sterling Capital. I turned slightly to look over my shoulder at my father, watching the blood physically drain from his face as the realization struck him. I informed the room that Sterling Capital was the aggressive private equity entity that currently held the exact $31 million defaulted corporate debt that Sterling Real Estate Holdings had failed to pay yesterday afternoon. I did not stop there. I turned my attention to Trent, whose smug smirk was rapidly dissolving into abject horror. I added that Sterling Capital was also the primary holding company that had just successfully executed a hostile absolute majority acquisition of Vanguard Financial. The entire courtroom went dead silent. The air grew thick, heavy, and suffocating. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the room with the force of a concrete slab. Judge Vance slowly lowered the papers. His hands were visibly trembling. He was a man who understood the ruthless, unforgiving hierarchy of money. He looked at the unredacted filings, recognizing the sheer astronomical volume of liquid wealth and institutional leverage I possessed. He realized instantly that I did not just have enough money to buy his courtroom. I had enough offshore capital to buy the bank that held the mortgage to his private residence, the firm that managed his pension, and the political action committees that funded his entire judicial career. His entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The patronizing arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by a terrifying, desperate deference. He swallowed hard nervously, adjusting his collar, recognizing that he was no longer speaking to a disgraced daughter, but to the single most powerful financial entity in the room. Before my father could even open his mouth to articulate an objection, a shrill, piercing electronic ring shattered the absolute silence of the courtroom. It was Trent's mobile phone. Under any normal circumstance, a ringing cellular device in Judge Vance's courtroom would result in an immediate citation for contempt. The judge simply sat frozen behind his bench, staring at me in terror, completely ignoring the blatant violation. Trent fumbled wildly in his jacket pocket, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device on the hardwood floor. He looked at the caller ID, his face turning the color of old ash. It was the private direct emergency line for the Vanguard Financial Executive Board. The board I now completely owned. He answered the call, pressing the phone to his ear with a trembling hand. The courtroom was so deathly quiet that the sharp, aggressive voice on the other end of the line was faintly audible. I knew exactly who was calling. It was Marcus, executing my explicit, pre-authorized corporate directives. Trent did not say a single word. He just listened. He listened as his new superiors officially informed him that he was being unceremoniously and permanently terminated from his position as chief financial officer, effective immediately. He listened as Marcus detailed the precise, irrefutable charges of gross institutional negligence, reckless credit leverage, and direct corporate embezzlement. I watched Trent's knees physically buckle as he realized the source of the evidence. I had personally handed over the fully decrypted military-grade hard drives containing every single one of his illegal off-the-book wire transfers directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission the moment the bank acquisition cleared. Trent was not just losing his job, he was facing federal indictment. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. Chantal had been sitting in the first row of the gallery, dressed in head-to-toe designer labels, fully prepared to watch my public humiliation. As Trent dropped the phone, the reality of the situation finally penetrated her shallow, materialistic worldview. She realized that the bottomless bank accounts were frozen, the platinum credit cards were canceled, the lavish, untouchable lifestyle she had married into was completely, irreversibly gone. She stood up abruptly, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure panic. She screamed at Trent, completely ignoring the decorum of the court. She shrieked that he was a useless idiot, demanding to know how he could possibly lose everything to me. She threw her expensive leather handbag at his chest, completely melting down in a chaotic, embarrassing display of ruined entitlement. My father ignored her screaming. Jeremiah Sterling was staring at me, his imposing stature completely collapsed. He looked like an old, broken, terrified man. The realization that I legally owned the massive defaulted debt hanging over his entire company finally broke his spirit. He stumbled around the plaintiff's table, taking a desperate, shaky step toward me. He reached his hand out, his voice cracking with a pathetic, trembling desperation. He begged me to stop. He pleaded with me to drop the hostile acquisition, to forgive the $31 million debt. He looked at me with tears welling in his eyes, whispering that we were family. He begged me to remember that we were blood. I looked down at his outstretched, trembling hand. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of familial obligation. My expression remained completely carved from ice. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered my final absolute truth. I coldly reminded him that blood was exactly what he had completely ignored when he chose to forcefully erase my mother's legacy. Blood was exactly what he had happily discarded when he threw me out of my own company, publicly humiliated me, and tried to strip away everything I had built. I told him he had willingly sacrificed his own flesh and blood just to blindly protect a mediocre white man's ego, simply because Trent fit his outdated patriarchal vision of corporate leadership. He had traded his daughter for an illusion of control, and now he was going to pay the exact market price for that decision. I turned my back on my father, leaving him standing broken and weeping in the aisle. I faced the bench, my voice echoing with total, undisputed authority. I officially submitted the formal motion to seize all operational assets, properties, and holding accounts belonging to Sterling Real Estate Holdings to satisfy the defaulted corporate loans held by Sterling Capital. Judge Vance did not hesitate for a single second. He did not ask for further review. He did not look at my father for confirmation. Terrified of the financial power I now wielded over his city, the judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a thunderous, definitive crack. The motion was granted in full. The empire was legally mine. The heavy wooden gavel fell, and with that single sharp crack, the Sterling Empire was officially dismantled. The fallout was not a gradual decline. It was a rapid, violent, and highly publicized systemic collapse. 7 days later, I stood on the bustling downtown Atlanta pavement with a cup of black coffee in my hand, watching the physical manifestation of my absolute victory. High above the street, a massive industrial crane hummed and groaned against the morning wind. Sparks rained down from the glass facade of the corporate headquarters as a team of welders methodically cut away the heavy steel letters spelling out Jeremiah Sterling. I watched the rusted metal letters swing wildly on thick steel cables before being unceremoniously dropped into the back of a waiting dump truck. In their place, the crane hoisted up a row of sleek, illuminated titanium letters. They spelled out my mother's maiden name. The exact legacy my father had tried so desperately to erase was now permanently bolted to the city skyline, casting a long, undeniable shadow over the financial district. While I was busy restructuring the board of directors from the top floor of my new building, Trent and Chantal were drowning in a spectacular nightmare. The federal indictment from the Securities and Exchange Commission hit Trent like a runaway freight train. He was stripped of his corporate immunity, his passports were seized, and his personal assets were completely frozen by federal investigators. To keep Trent out of a maximum security federal penitentiary, they needed immediate liquid cash for a high-powered defense team. Chantal experienced a brutal, unforgiving crash into reality. I received regular updates from my legal team detailing her desperate attempts to stay afloat. The repo men arrived at their sprawling suburban estate before dawn, hauling away the matching luxury SUVs and the vintage sports cars Trent loved to flaunt. Chantal was forced to endure the ultimate high society humiliation. She hosted a frantic, heavily publicized estate sale right on her manicured front lawn. The same socialite friends she used to entertain and gossip with now picked through her heavily discounted designer handbags, vintage Rolexes, and custom Milanese evening gowns, haggling over pennies. Without the protective insulation of endless wealth, their marriage instantly turned into a toxic war zone. The superficial foundation they had built entirely on greed and status violently imploded. Neighbors reported hearing vicious, echoing screaming matches radiating from their empty foyer. Chantal blamed Trent for getting caught, and Trent blamed Chantal for draining his accounts. The final blow came when the bank officially foreclosed on their mansion. Chantal packed whatever remaining synthetic luggage she could salvage and walked out, leaving Trent to face his federal charges entirely alone in a cheap rented motel room. Her golden ticket to Atlanta royalty had become a sinking radioactive ship, and she abandoned it without a second thought. My father faced a much quieter but infinitely more agonizing destruction. The court-ordered asset seizure stripped Jeremiah of absolutely everything. The sprawling golf course estate, the offshore accounts, the vintage wine collections, and the private club memberships were all instantly liquidated to satisfy the massive corporate debt he owed my firm. He was forcibly relocated to a cramped beige two-bedroom condo on the outskirts of the city, a neighborhood he had spent his entire career aggressively trying to gentrify and demolish. The absolute worst punishment for Jeremiah was not the loss of square footage. It was the deafening silence of his phone. The powerful politicians, the elite developers, and the corrupt judges who used to drink expensive bourbon in his mahogany study dropped him the exact second the news of my hostile takeover hit the financial papers. He became a total corporate pariah overnight. Men who used to beg for his favor now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. He spent his days sitting in a cheap recliner in a low-ceilinged living room, entirely ostracized from the high society circles he had worshipped and sacrificed his own family to maintain. He was left with nothing but the crushing, inescapable realization that his power was never real. It was only ever a fragile illusion built on my mother's stolen capital, and I had simply taken it back. The physical dismantling of their toxic empire is complete. The morning after the signage changed, I walked through the revolving glass doors of the newly rebranded headquarters. The atmosphere inside the main lobby was thick with paralyzing anxiety. Ground-level employees, administrative assistants, and junior analysts were already huddled at their desks, clutching cardboard boxes, fully expecting a ruthless corporate bloodbath. They had spent years watching my father and Trent terminate entire departments on a whim, just to artificially inflate quarterly profit margins. They assumed the hostile takeover meant they were all collateral damage. I stepped onto the polished marble floor and asked the head of human resources to call an immediate all-hands meeting in the central atrium. Hundreds of nervous faces gathered expecting the worst. I did not stand on a balcony and look down at them the way Jeremiah always did. I stood right in the middle of the floor on their level. I announced that effective immediately, the toxic, top-heavy executive structure Trent had meticulously built was dissolved. The predatory vice presidents and the sycophantic regional managers who had enabled my father's corrupt practices had already been locked out of the building. But to the ground level employees, the people who actually kept the lights on and the operations running, I delivered a completely different message. Nobody was packing a box today. Nobody was losing their health insurance. Instead, I announced a comprehensive company-wide restructuring focused entirely on equitable pay. I immediately raised the baseline salary for every administrative worker and cut the excessive executive bonus pool to fund comprehensive benefits for the entire staff. The collective gasp of relief that rippled through the atrium was the first genuine sound that building had heard in over a decade. I then outlined the new corporate directive. We were no longer in the business of predatory gentrification. We were entirely abandoning the aggressive acquisition strategies that deliberately displaced vulnerable communities just to build soulless, overpriced condominiums. I was taking the company back to its absolute roots. I pulled up the original architectural blueprints my mother had drafted 30 years ago. I detailed our new uncompromising commitment to community-focused, sustainable Black development in Atlanta. We were going to build affordable housing initiatives, fund commercial spaces strictly for local minority-owned businesses, and invest directly back into the neighborhoods my father had spent his entire career trying to bulldoze. I was not just taking back a company, I was resurrecting my mother's stolen dream and giving it the limitless financial backing it always deserved. Months later, the dust had completely settled. The brutal corporate war was a closed chapter, and the newly restructured firm was thriving beyond any metric Wall Street had predicted. I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of my new downtown penthouse. The heavy heat of the Georgia summer had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, cool evening breeze. I rested my hands on the railing, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline as the sun began its slow descent. The sky was burning in brilliant shades of violet and deep gold, reflecting off the glass towers that shaped the city. Somewhere out there, the community centers my mother had envisioned were finally breaking ground. The quiet, absolute serenity of the moment was briefly interrupted by a sharp vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but the desperate, rambling tone was unmistakably familiar. It was Jeremiah. The message was a pathetic, sprawling paragraph, stripped of all his former arrogance. He wrote that his condo association was threatening eviction. He begged me to remember the good times from my childhood, completely fabricating a history of parental warmth that never existed. He pleaded for a second chance, asking if we could just sit down for coffee. He ended the message by begging for a small, temporary loan just to help him get back on his feet, promising he would pay me back with interest. I stared at the glowing text message against the backdrop of the darkening city. I waited for the familiar spike of anger, the deep, burning resentment that had fueled my ascension for the past 5 years. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no rage, there was no vindictive thrill, there was only a profound, hollow indifference. He was no longer a towering, terrifying patriarch capable of destroying my life. He was just a ghost, an echo of a past I had completely conquered and outgrown. Without a single change in my heart rate, I tapped the screen. I deleted the message. I permanently blocked the number. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, picked up my ceramic mug, and took a slow, savoring sip of black coffee. I turned my attention back to the horizon, watching the city lights slowly flicker on in the gathering dusk. The air was calm. The silence was beautiful. I was finally at peace, standing alone, at the absolute summit of an empire I had built entirely on my own terms. The story of J.L. Sterling perfectly illustrates that true power is never given. It is meticulously built in the shadows and executed with unwavering precision. When faced with deep systemic betrayal and toxic family dynamics, the ultimate revenge is not found in emotional outbursts or petty arguments, but in absolute, undeniable success. The protagonist powerfully teaches us that we must always transform our deepest wounds into fuel for our greatest ambitions. By reclaiming her mother's erased legacy and rebuilding an empire on equitable community-driven values, she proves that the most devastating way to destroy your oppressors is to outgrow them. If this story of absolute resilience and reclaiming your power resonated with your own journey, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories, and drop a comment below, sharing how you overcame the toxic people in your life.